Hi there. As you can see, I've escaped from my office. Different backdrop. I'm spending a few days with my in-laws in Ireland, and always great to be here in Dublin. But the PowerPlayChess channel must continue. So here we go with a little report on round 4 of the Sinquefield Cup. And I'm going to be looking at the game between Hans Niemann and Alireza Firouzja. Of course, I'll be saying a few words about Carlsen's withdrawal from the tournament. I'll leave that till the end of this game. A lot to talk about. Anyway, here we go. Niemann against Alireza Firouzja. Battle of the two 19-year-olds. And it's a pretty regular opening. A gioco piano. All the pieces on the board. All very normal, both sides castling, and rook e1. And white is perhaps preparing to play d4 with that move, but also perhaps leaving open this route for the knight to come to f1 and so on. Pretty normal stuff so far. a4, white wants to perhaps gain a little bit of space on the queen side. a5 stops that. h3, perhaps preventing a knight g4 or bishop g4. Likewise with h6, knight a3. Knight bounces out, might come to c4, might come back to c2. And now Alireza switches the knight round to the king side. A very, very familiar maneuver, and perhaps prepares to play c6 to bring the bishop back to c7. d4. So at this point, Niemann advances in the middle, and knight g6 supports the e-pawn. Now, I really like Hans Niemann's next move here. Previously, actually, there was a game that went bishop b3, keeping the bishop on this, well, important diagonal. But actually, here, Niemann plays bishop f1. And to my mind, that makes a lot of sense, because quite often black wants to play with the knight to h5 and then into f4, and the bishop just covers the king side very nicely. But also it makes room for the knight to come into c4, which it does so. And yeah, with the knight on c4, feels like white is doing quite well here. Alireza recaptured on e5 with the knight. If pawn takes, then, well, I mean, this just feels like white is already a bit better. Maybe queen c2 and rook d1. I mean, a few good moves. Bishop e3. You can see these pieces look very nicely placed. Looking at these squares, looks good. You know, basically a little bit better for white. So knight takes played instead. I think exchanging pieces is going to help black a little bit. Bishop f4 played. So white has a slight space advantage here. And if queen e7, let's say, then at some point this knight might be able to come to d4. Maybe this move first, actually, and then knight d4. White has that little bit of space, and that's certainly more comfortable. You know, you can imagine if the knight comes to d4, the bishop comes back, and f4, then black is getting squeezed in that position. And with the rook on e1 opposite the queen, it's difficult for black to break out with d5. That's the problem. Anyway, after bishop f4, Alireza exchanged on f3, and then played d5. So this is basically an attempt to equalize the position. And if white wants to, if Niemann wants to, then he could play, for example, sorry, I lost my place a moment. You could just exchange on d5 here. I think white is certainly a little bit more comfortable in this position. White certainly doesn't risk anything. The danger with these kind of positions is that if white's initiative peters out, then structurally, of course, white has no advantage at all. So what Niemann did was play rook d1 instead, and of course it's more ambitious, keeping pieces on the board, and it does look very natural to put the rook opposite the queen. You just have to make sure that black can't take any of the pieces. So in fact this is simply winning for white actually. So rook d1 just feels very nice indeed. Bishop e6 from Firouzja. And once again, white could take here, and I think he's a little bit more comfortable. But if black plays accurately, you feel that black should equalize. But e5 played instead by Niemann, and that is a very ambitious move because it leaves black with a nice pawn chain in the center. However, this kingside majority, this pawn on e5 acts as a kind of spearhead. And with the queen already on f3, then white can look to get some kind of attack on the king side. This is what it's about. Knight d7 played. And here, yeah, if white backs down, you can see at the moment pawn takes knight is threatened. So feels, well, you know, it seems like white should be moving that knight, but if the knight returns to d2, then f6, and this suddenly looks like white is losing the initiative. I mean, this is not what white wants. It might be okay for white, but actually with this strong pawn chain, and black is very well coordinated here, that feels pretty nice. It's not what white wants. Or there's knight d6, that doesn't actually work because black can take here, simple tactics, wins a pawn. So Niemann played queen g3. He'd had his big think when he played e5 actually, and he played queen g3 fairly quickly. And this is a very interesting move. So it's of course critical if black takes here, but you can see that white's pieces are beautifully set up. Bishop h6. So this did not happen, I should emphasize. Mate threatened on g7. So g6, pretty much forced. And here, well, I mean, without going into huge detail, white has excellent compensation for the piece. The best move here is bishop g5. And if the queen comes to e8, then well, that's pretty simple. The queen comes to h4, and that's going to be the end. So black has to play f6, and then bishop h6. This is threatened. I mean, this looks so shaky for white, actually. Bishop takes. If queen takes, then bishop comes here. I mean, white's pieces are fantastic. So king takes. Now f4. So the material balance is, let me see, rook against two minor pieces. And yeah, rook and pawn against two minor pieces. So roughly level in terms of material. But you can see that the activity that white has is tremendous. Fantastic coordination. This rook shot out of play. The computer still thinks that black is okay here, but I think in practical play this is extremely difficult. And well, Niemann judged that really he would have excellent play after pawn takes knight. So Alireza played king h8 instead. But after knight d6, this is clearly better for white, because now, of course, knight takes pawn doesn't work because of bishop takes, and there is a mate threatened on g7. So knight c5. And here Niemann plays rook d4, which looks pretty threatening. The rook in some cases can swing over to the king side, but in fact the computer thinks that there are two superior moves for white. One is to play bishop takes pawn, and this is quite scary. The queen threatens queen h6 with devastation, and queen takes knight. In fact, this is still, well, it's better for white, but this is quite scary because suddenly black has quite a dangerous counterattack here. Two bishops, queen and rook. If white defends correctly, white is better, but that's tricky. The move that looks really promising actually is pawn to c4, and this just breaks down black's control in the middle of the board, breaks down that pawn chain, and this really does look better for white. But rook d4 played is still very dangerous for black. The knight comes into e4, and, well, the queen could withdraw here, and that gives white the better chances. Looks pretty good for white. But Niemann played in a very natural way, actually. He simply sacrificed the exchange. And this also looks very dangerous. Queen comes over to defend. And here, well, in the interview after the game, Niemann was kicking himself for not playing bishop e3 in this position. And bishop e3 does look very strong. Let's have a very quick look. Bishop e3. I mean, the point is that, well, after bishop f5, the rook comes down to e7. Looks really powerful. If rook e8, then bishop d3. Bishop f5 doesn't work now because that is incredibly strong. White is winning material. If rook d8, let's say, bishop b6, exchange of queens, bishop c7. Basically, white's bishops are really strong there. Excellent compensation for the exchange with the pawn and the bishop. It's not yet winning, but basically bishop e3 will keep the bishops on the both bishops on the board. In the game, bishop d3 allowed bishop f5. Now, if the rook comes down to e7, then this simply wins a piece. So in the game, this is what happened. The bishops were exchanged, and then queen f5. Excellent move. You can see that once the light square bishops are off the board, then the queen, for example, is able to operate relatively safely. It's easier to get a blockade on d7. And it's easier to defend the king, actually, as well. It's all to do with that queen, and all to do with the fact that the bishops are off the board, and that's what Niemann could have prevented. But white is certainly not worse in this position. You just have to look at that fantastic pawn on d6, well supported, to realise that white has enough compensation here. But black is on the board now. If the pawn advances, actually, that's not too good. It gets scooped up. But queen e3 is a good move. Rook e8 and queen d2. So it supports the bishop, supports, well, all these pieces basically. White is well coordinated. And again, if that's advanced, that's premature. The pawn gets wrapped up, gets taken. So bishop e3, c5, that cuts out the bishop, the influence of the bishop over here. And here, Niemann played, to my eyes, a really surprising move. And it kind of shows his ambition, actually, because, I mean, there's an obvious sacrifice here. And that's bishop h6. So this was not played. And if it's taken, queen takes. Now, if the king comes to g8, then, of course, the rook swings across the board. Not good. So the queen has to block. And queen f6 check. And once again, if the king comes to g8, then rook g3 check. So queen g7. Another check on h4. If the king comes to g8, then this is certainly winning for white. White has a lot of pawns here. You can even pick up another pawn here. So basically after the check, the queen has to block again. And, well, you can see what's happening. Basically, the position repeats and it's a draw. Now, I'm really surprised that Niemann didn't go for that, actually, because I think by this stage, it's pretty clear that Firouzja has found his feet in the position after the exchange of bishops. But it shows that Niemann he's really ambitious. He wanted to play this position on. He said after the game, I can't be worse in this kind of position with the pawn on d6. Well, I think you can be worse if you're not careful. And g4, is a little bit loose. But anyway, this is how the game went. Bishop d4, threatening a mighty check on h6 because of the pin. And rook e6. The computer prefers king g8, but it's a very tricky position. Rook e6 is certainly not a bad move. Bishop b6, rook d7. And Niemann played bishop c7 here, which looks very natural. You can see that rook is now shut in by these pieces. And it certainly feels in practical terms as though this is going to be rather difficult for black to guess anything. But here actually Firouzja misses, I think, a strong continuation. I didn't see the game live, so I wonder whether he was a bit short of time. He's certainly playing, looking at the clock times, he was playing these last moves fairly quickly. But he could have played check and then rook e1. And this is a strong counterattack. And rook h1, and the queen switches over. Now, it's not cut and dried, this position, by any means, but that is dangerous. But instead, queen c6, that's kind of a safe move. So Firouzja is just kind of holding the position. And rook e3 played. Rook d5 is probably a better move, actually. Just shutting out black's queen. But anyway, rook e3, exchange of rooks. And here, well, I think Firouzja made a good practical decision. He decided simply to return the exchange, and now the position is completely level. And indeed, the game ended with a repetition like so. If we just come back a moment, instead of exchanging rooks, the computer indicates that this is a possible way of playing the position, playing a4. And it is, there's an incredible way for black to make progress here, but I have to show it to you. Again, I cannot imagine this would ever be played in a game, even by the strongest players in the world. But it's very interesting to see how the computer thinks that black might be able to make progress. Like this. Basically, white just has to wait here. And now g6. And here is the idea. Let's suppose that white waits with king h2. f5. Wow. So the idea is that the rook now is able to operate on the 7th rank. The queen will cover d7. So for example, after the pawns are exchanged, then after rook g7, whoa, suddenly, what a counterattack. And if the pawns aren't exchanged, then, well, an exchange on g4 and the rook may come to f7 and get some pressure here. And suddenly it looks like that bishop, which seemed to be doing a good job actually controlling the rook, supporting the pawn, that bishop suddenly looks out of play on c7. But such moves like g6 and f5, well, incredibly difficult to spot. And well, I mean, when you're short of time, absolutely impossible. But also, I mean, incredibly risky strategy because it feels like you're exposing your own king as well. Anyway, that was the final position with this repetition. Summing up this game, I think it was a bit uneven actually. I think there were mistakes from both sides, and Hans Niemann certainly didn't make the most of his chances. Okay, let's come back to the big issue, and that is Magnus Carlsen's withdrawal from the tournament after 3 rounds, after his round 3 loss against Hans Niemann. So I don't believe that Carlsen has ever withdrawn from a tournament in his life. And he announced his withdrawal with a tweet attaching a famous clip of the legendary football manager Jose Mourinho after a game in the Premier League in England, where Mourinho was clearly not happy with some of the referee's decisions. And Mourinho said famously, "If I speak, I'm in trouble." So Carlsen, that's how he left the tournament. So adding all this up, Carlsen clearly suspects that there was some form of cheating involved in his game against Hans Niemann. And I mean, people have been piling on social media, on Twitter, and everyone has an opinion. And looking at the post-game interviews with Hans Niemann, if you wish to, you can find evidence that supports a view that he was cheating. But you can also find evidence that supports a view that his play is completely clean. It's just confirmation bias, seems to me. And likewise, looking at his game against Carlsen, I think, if you're looking at it with a computer, you can also find evidence that Niemann was cheating, because in some moments he played excellently, but in other moments he didn't play the best move according to the computer. So again, you can look at the computer evaluations and find evidence that supports your view. Basically, until there is hard and fast evidence that something took place, that cheating took place, as far as I'm concerned, Hans Niemann is innocent. I look forward to hearing more from Magnus Carlsen. If he produces evidence that we can all judge, fine. But if he prefers not to say anything and basically casts a shadow over Niemann's play without evidence, then I find that very unsatisfactory. That's all, folks. Let me hear what you think. Thanks for watching.